The Whispering Shadows, a House with Secrets. Welcome to a true and terrifying story that completely changed our lives. My name is Edwin, and this is the tale of the nights when I experienced fear like never before. I met my wife in 2004 and we got married the following year. We were a young couple living a simple life, myself working in education, and my wife chasing her dream in the medical field. In 2007, we received a strange offer from someone in the village. There was an elderly woman who needed round-the-clock care. Her family did not want to place her in a nursing home, so they decided she could live with a family who would look after her. She was to have her own room and access to the kitchen, while the rest of the house would remain ours. The offer was tempting, especially since it would help cover some expenses. We agreed, and the woman moved in with us in July. From the moment the woman entered our home, I felt something odd that I couldn't explain. She was an unusual person, never smiling, and always speaking in a cold and harsh tone. She spent most of her time in her wheelchair, watching shows about the supernatural. At first, this didn't bother us, but something about it created a charged, uneasy atmosphere in the house. A few weeks later, strange things began to happen. We would return home to find the lights upstairs turning on and off, even though we had made sure to switch them off before leaving. My wife began hearing faint footsteps in the hallways at night, while I would sometimes wake up to the sound of whispers coming from the woman's room. One night, after returning late from a Bible study, we found the house in a strange state. The lights in the upstairs hallway were flickering erratically, as if warning us. I entered the woman's room to find her sitting in the dark, staring silently at the wall. When I asked her if she was all right, she slowly turned to me and said in a low voice, "He's here, but he doesn't want you." The fear began to consume us, and we decided to investigate the house's history. We discovered that the woman had lived there her entire life and that her family had mysteriously disappeared years ago under unexplained circumstances. We couldn't find many details, but the story only added to our growing terror. One night, the fear reached its peak. We woke to the sound of something heavy crashing to the floor. Rushing to the woman's room, we found it empty, though her wheelchair was still there. We searched everywhere until we found her sitting in the living room, staring into the air as if seeing something invisible to us. We tried to speak to her, but she didn't respond. She only muttered, "You can't stop him. He's here because he wants to stay." Desperate, we called the local church priest for help. When he entered the house, his expression immediately changed. He told us the place was filled with immense negative energy and that he would attempt a ritual to expel the dark presence. During the ritual, unnatural things began to happen. The lights went out suddenly and inhuman whispers filled the room, as though the walls themselves were speaking. By the end of the ritual, the priest looked exhausted and said, "There is something dark here, but it is not ready to leave." The next day, the woman left the house without warning, leaving behind a small note that read, "You opened the door, and now you can't close it." Even today, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps in the hallways and the feeling of something watching me in the dark. I can't explain what happened, but I know that something changed in our lives from that moment on. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. The Black Magic Book. A true horror story. Our protagonist couldn't resist his growing curiosity about the infamous book, Shams al-Ma'arif. After finishing his first-year university exams, he visited an old library and managed to acquire a replicated version of the book. Overwhelmed with joy, he returned home, concealing the book until the right moment. 10 days later, when his family attended a cousin's wedding, he feigned illness and stayed home alone. He had already decided on the first spell to try. He gathered candles, extinguished all the lights in the house, and meticulously followed the instructions. After drawing the symbols for the spell, he waited for a sign. As he went to check the coffee on the stove, he returned to find all the candles extinguished. This was the signal he had unknowingly invoked. Moments later, he was startled by his family returning early. Confused, he asked them why they had come back. They seemed equally puzzled, claiming he must have fallen asleep and woken up disoriented. Shocked to realize how much time had passed without him noticing, he waited days for the spirit he believed he had summoned. But nothing happened. Frustrated, he resolved to try a stronger spell that required a black cat's sacrifice. Troubled by the requirement, he dismissed the idea, unwilling to harm an innocent creature. That evening, the doorbell rang. When he opened it, a black cat stood before him, staring as if offering itself. He interpreted this as fate. He followed the ritual precisely, using the cat's blood to draw symbols in the bathroom, even mixing some with his own blood. He let the mixture drip from his head to his body, awaiting a sign. But his family returned, interrupting his ritual. He hastily cleaned up, hiding the evidence. That same night, strange occurrences began. As he returned from work, he found his little sister sitting on the stairs in the dark. When he called out, she ran inside. Following her, he shouted angrily, only for his father to confront him, saying his sister had been asleep for hours. Entering her room, he found her in a deep slumber, wearing different clothes from the ones he'd seen earlier. 3 days later, he fell asleep on the couch near the bathroom. He awoke, feeling black, clawed hands pulling him under the couch. Terrified, he struggled, but when he opened his eyes, a horrifying figure stood before him, a queen of the jinn. She told him she had killed the spirit he had summoned in his first attempt, and demanded he dismiss her or face dire consequences. But he didn't know how to dismiss her, as the book offered no guidance for such situations. That same week, his mother fell into a strange, unresponsive state. She didn't recognize her family, refused to eat, and couldn't sleep. Doctors were baffled by her condition. They had to tie her hands and feet to the bed to prevent her from harming herself. The boy's uncle, living in Saudi Arabia, rushed to visit. Upon seeing his sister's deteriorating condition, he immediately recognized the signs of a jinn's influence. A spiritual healer with years of experience, the uncle confronted the young man, demanding to know about the book. Terrified, the boy confessed and retrieved it from where he had hidden it on the roof. The uncle burned the book and began treating the mother, gradually driving the jinn away. While the strange occurrences in the house diminished, the young man continued to suffer. The jinn queen refused to leave him unscathed. She appeared to him frequently, tormenting him, but he couldn't speak about it. A month later, his family found him lifeless in the bathroom, covered in his own blood. On the floor, the same symbols he had drawn during his rituals were etched once more. Despite the book being destroyed, the darkness he had invited into his life never truly left. Curiosity may open doors better left closed. The cursed grave. Graves have always had the power to instill fear and evoke deep terror within us. None of us can deny that they provoke unease. What's even more troubling is that they heighten our curiosity to a degree that could lead to great harm. Here is a story. It happened to me a long time ago, more than 15 years back. That day, my father passed away. May God have mercy on him and bless his soul. We went to the cemetery, which was far from our home, located in an isolated mountainous area. I was among those who went to bury my father and bid him farewell. After the burial was complete, everyone returned home, except for me. Despite their earnest attempts to take me back with them, I refused and chose to stay by my father's side. I stayed there reciting the Quran next to him. My father was the most beloved person in my life. Throughout his life, he showered me with love. He was both a loyal friend and a wise, compassionate father. I could not bear the shock of his departure, nor could I accept the idea of him being alone, buried under the earth, far from me. At that time, I was still young, and this was the first death I had ever experienced. I remember feeling as if something had gone wrong with my mind. I couldn't comprehend what had happened. My eyes didn't dry from tears, not even for a moment. I remember being in a truly pitiful state that day. Everyone in my family tried to convince me to return with them. Some even offered to stay with me to keep me company, but I refused vehemently. They repeatedly said it was unwise to stay alone in the cemetery, especially at night, surrounded by the pitch-black darkness. Their faces became increasingly alarmed as they spoke about how graves are places everyone fears, and they expressed their astonishment at my decision to stay alone there, especially at night. With my insistence, they left and I remained alone beside my father's grave, reciting what I had memorized of the Quran. I owe my memorization to him, as he always encouraged me to learn and recite the entire Quran. Suddenly, while reading and with tears streaming down my face from the pain of loss, I heard a sound coming from within the grave. I moved closer, ever closer, until I pressed my ear against the grave itself. Could it be my father's voice? I screamed, calling for the cemetery keeper, who rushed to me. In a voice trembling with terror, I asked him if he could hear the same sound I was hearing. He answered, his concern for me evident, that he could hear nothing. He refused to leave me alone and took me back home. I was certain I had heard a sound from my father's grave, a sound resembling screaming, as if someone were calling for help. When I returned home, I went to my uncle and asked him, "Uncle, did my father really die? Did you ensure that he had truly passed away? What if he fell into a coma and we mistakenly buried him alive?" My uncle was shocked by my words and assured me that my father had been in an accident. Despite attempts to resuscitate him and multiple surgeries, he never regained consciousness. He had spent nearly a month in a coma, and when he passed away, his heart, brain, and all bodily functions had stopped. "How could we have buried him alive?" my uncle said. Yet, something deep inside me kept telling me that my father was still alive, and that those cries I heard were his calls for help. The next day, I returned to the cemetery and stayed there, reciting the Quran and praying for God to have mercy on him. Night fell without me noticing, until I heard the same cries again. I approached the source of the sound and drew closer until I realized it was coming from the grave next to my father's. I tried to read the inscription on the grave to learn whose it was, but to my surprise, the name was scratched off in a strange manner. I ran to the cemetery keeper. I described the grave to him and asked about its history. I also told him about the unsettling sounds I had heard on 2 consecutive nights. The keeper's response chilled me to the bone. "Son," he said, "didn't I warn you not to stay alone in the cemetery, especially at night? The world of the dead is not like ours. You shouldn't meddle with it. But since you're so troubled, I'll tell you the truth. That grave belongs to an old woman who, during her lifetime, was a witch. She spent her life harming others and summoning evil jinn to do her bidding. Ever since she was buried, I've heard terrifying screams coming from that grave, but I've never dared to interfere. Her name was scratched off the tombstone by someone she wronged in her lifetime." I left the graveyard that day and never returned. Strangely though, the screams of that old woman continue to haunt me to this day. The Haunted Barrack, a soldier's night of terror. On a cold winter night, I was assigned an urgent mission to complete some military paperwork at a distant battalion. The battalion was far from my unit, but I proceeded without hesitation, fully aware of the importance of the task. Once I had finished everything required of me, I realized that time had passed, and the last service vehicles had already left. I was left in a difficult situation. The main road was far, and walking in this pitch-black darkness was not a safe option. I contacted the commander of my unit and explained my predicament. After some thought, he instructed me to spend the night at the battalion and return in the morning, emphasizing that traveling in these circumstances would be too risky. Relieved that I had a plan, I decided to look for a place to spend the night. I started at the mess hall, where the atmosphere was eerily quiet, broken only by the howling of the wind outside. The soldier in charge was preparing to close up for the night. I asked if I could stay there, but he told me the mess hall would be locked soon. He suggested I look for one of the barracks, where there were plenty of empty beds. I thanked him and began my search. The barracks were dimly lit and eerily deserted. As I walked through the corridors, I felt an unsettling stillness, as though I was being watched. Passing by one of the barracks, I heard sounds coming from inside, laughter and lively conversations. It sounded like a group of soldiers enjoying themselves. Relieved by the thought of some company, I approached the door, hoping to join them and lighten the long night. As I prepared to knock, the sounds suddenly changed. The laughter stopped, replaced by sobbing and then loud crashes, as if someone were smashing the beds to pieces. I hesitated, but my curiosity pushed me to open the door and see what was happening. Just as I reached for the handle, a cold, powerful hand grabbed my arm and yanked me inside. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into complete darkness. I screamed as loudly as I could, but my voice echoed back at me as if swallowed by the void. Quickly, I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The sight before me froze my blood. The walls were smeared with dried blood, with handprints scattered as though people had tried to claw their way out. The beds were overturned, and lying upon them were the mangled bodies of soldiers, their eyes wide open, staring at me with accusatory glares. Blood was still dripping from some of them, as though the gruesome scene had just unfolded. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the room itself was suffocating me. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs were paralyzed. Then I heard a low whisper near my ear, speaking words I couldn't understand but filled with malice. I felt trapped between two worlds, the living and the dead. Suddenly I heard footsteps approaching from outside. The door burst open and a soldier stepped in holding a Quran. He began reciting verses in a steady, unwavering voice. With each verse, the horrific scene around me began to change. The bodies disappeared, the blood faded, and the oppressive darkness seemed to retreat. The room returned to its previous state, empty and silent, as if nothing had happened. The soldier grabbed my arm and led me outside quickly. Once we were safe, he glared at me and demanded, "What were you doing in there?" Still shaking, I struggled to explain. He then recounted the chilling history of the barrack. Years ago, a horrific tragedy had occurred there. A dispute between soldiers escalated, leading one of them to lose control and brutally murder his comrades before taking his own life. Since then, the barrack had been avoided by everyone, as it was said to be haunted by the tormented spirits of those who had perished. I spent the rest of the night in the mess hall, trembling with fear. The following morning, I left the battalion as quickly as I could. When I returned to my unit, I felt as though I had been given a new lease on life. Yet, That night remained etched in my memory. Even years later, I still recall the horrifying details and wonder. Was I truly a victim of another world, or was my mind playing a cruel trick on me in the dead of that dark winter night?